Happy New Breath, everyone. Yes. May I invite all of you just to relax a little bit and just take in a couple of deep breaths with me. Well, the breath that we just inhale together sustains our lives. But yet sometimes we forget about that, right? Because that's the survival breath that we are accustomed to just coming. And so we're just breathing and living life. But yet, how many of us really intentionally breathe and thrive with that breath, right? Knowing that the breath sustains our life, how do we thrive with that breath? Yes. I think this is another time to take a new breath. Yes. So you're in a live show, so that's why it's like everything is live, right? So there's no fake actors and, any of that. But today I really want to engage you in this conversation about shifting the narrative to qi. Can we say qi together? Qi. Well, it's the qi that I'm talking about is not just the life force and, the breath that's sustaining our lives. The qi that I'm talking about is culture, history, and identity, right? So I know we're talking about life. I do need a clicker to click to the next slide, right? So you know what I'm talking about. Yes, that's the qi that I'm talking about. It's culture, history, identity, which is a way of, I frame it in a way that's like culturally responsive approach to trauma, right? So now, you look at me, do I identify with some of the modern minority myth that Alexis was talking about earlier? I do look like that, right? But, for me, the reason I was able to really tap into my qi really was, that's when I get politically and socially conscious, is when I was able to tap into my qi, right? I remember it was 2002. I was in San Quentin State Prison solitary confinement because I signed a proposal with two of my friends asking for ethnic studies. And I was thrown into solitary confinement by the administration because they say that I was a troublemaker. Well, because I knew the importance of the culture, history, identity that really define who I am as an individual, I really want to know about other people's culture and history and identity. So in that process, I was really trying to advocate how do we use ethnic studies as a way to heal intergenerational trauma? How do we humanize each other? So, as someone who spent 21 years of my life incarcerated, I really found what I wanted to do with my life, right? Which is to service the youth and the community. Because I went into the system at the age of 16 as a new immigrant coming from China and didn't come out until I was an adult. So in that process, I felt that had it not been ethnic studies, then I wouldn't have become who I am today. So one of the things I did post-release after 21 years, I co-founded this program in San Quentin State Prison. It's called the Reus program. The Reus program really focuses on cultural history and identity as a way to empower individuals who are incarcerated so they can heal the intergenerational trauma. So when we look at that, we always think that, well, Asians go to prison? Well, unfortunately, under the mass incarceration era, started the institution of slavery. Yes, Asian American and Pacific Islanders do go to prisons. And even though we are a small number of those people, we're still impacted. And the way that we impacted is a little different. And so that's why I want to just kind of look at a little bit about this pipeline. The pipeline of migration to school to prison and deportation. Normally we talk about how detrimental the school to prison pipeline is for the Black and brown community. But for many of the refugee communities and the immigrant communities, the forced migration as a result of the United States policy pushes that narrative a little further, right? So That's why the forced migration to the school-to-prison deportation pipeline plays a big part in many of the immigrant and refugee community. So when we talk about black and brown, well, many of the black and brown are refugees and immigrants. So let's not forget about that, right? So that's why the mass incarceration under the pretense of, slavery has ended, which is false, right? Under the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, slavery is still alive. It's still legal. So we are continuing to be exploited. So I want you to look at the pipeline in a way that, how do we see this pipeline in connection of class, race, gender, and sexuality? When it comes to racism, we can look at racism in different ways, right? As one of the professors who taught at the Reus program, Professor Zheng, so he mentioned the fact that we have the cultural-based racism and national-based racism. The cultural-based racism we experience all the time because in the United States, we are a melting pot of immigrants, right? But yet, with the recent drop by the administration on the public charge, you wouldn't think that we're a melting pot who helped the United States to propel to become the superpower as it is. It's because immigrants make that happen, right? So we should never forget about that narrative. So that's why when we look at this pipeline, I want us to make sure to understand that in order for us to be able to understand that our struggle and our liberation are tied to each other, we have to understand our cultural history and our identity. Because that's how we're going to humanize each other, and that's how we're going to be able to find that possibility of now for 2020, like what the theme of this convening is about. How do we find that possibility of now? And that possibility is for us to really connect with each other. Now, the other model I find it in shifting the narrative is the New Breath Foundation. I started the New Breath Foundation because in national philanthropy, 0.6% of philanthropic dollars goes to support AAPI issues and organizations, which AAPI makes up 5.6% of the United States population. So that's unacceptable. So for me, it's about how do I create a seat at the philanthropy table and also create my own table so we can empower marginalized Asian American and Pacific Islander communities in relation to do cross-cultural healing and cross-cultural engagement. And that's why I sparked the New Breath Foundation. Now, I want to emphasize this again about the importance of Chi, right? When we look at poverty with the AAPI community, I just want to say a couple of stats. One, in San Francisco, California, we made up about 32% of the population in San Francisco, the AAPIs, but yet we also represent 42% of the low-income population. And in California, for workers, when we talk about poverty, and if you just take away the model minority myth, 4 out of 10 AAPI workers who are working are struggling in poverty. That's the data just came out from the AAPI data with the sponsorship from the James Irvine Foundation. You can just look it up online on that. Now, in New York, because, again, it's like California, we're living in an affluent community, in a society. For many of the people who live in SROs, living in some of the projects that we call it, they're struggling. They're struggling to find representation and resources. So that's why one of the groups that I really met as I was here is the Communities We Assist group, right? Which is the legal representation for people who are impacted by poverty and by this housing discrimination. So, lastly, I just want to share this with you. Now, had I had 2 hours, you would be mesmerized, right, by my presence, but I don't. So, but what I do want to say is this. I'm grateful for my presence here because representation does matter, right? The other thing is, I want you to remember this, right? This is something that I really internalized as I was incarcerated and then post-incarceration, is that we must be willing to engage on a personal revolution before we are able to embark on a collective revolution. If we are not healing ourselves, our families, and our community, how will we profess that we're going to heal everyone? We cannot do that. So culture, history, identity as a way to shift narrative And please engage in that personal revolution because I'm ready for you.